When you've been trained to believe that moisture will drip on the cluster and go to great lengths to eliminate it, it's really hard to hear that those efforts may result in the opposite of what you're trying to achieve.
Buzz.
Good evening. My name is Adrian Quiney, and since 2008, I've been keeping bees in Hudson, Wisconsin, and the surrounding area. I winter about 60 to 80 colonies, and so I'm heavily invested in northern sustainability. And if you're unable to winter your bees, then beekeeping isn't sustainable. The subject of this presentation is the insulation-ventilation conundrum. How much of each should we provide and whether it matters or not? Wintering systems are one of the most debated and confusing things that we talk about. Beekeepers in one camp seem obsessed with moisture and condensation and are not concerned about the cold, but there are just as many beekeepers on the other side who don't worry about moisture and condensation, but are instead of really heavily obsessed with insulation. One way to avoid the chills of winter is to winter indoors. And if a person has the money, time, and know-how, they might find this appealing. Personally, I have no interest in this. If I lived 8 hours further north in Canada, I might consider it. If you only have a few hives, styrofoam boxes might be an alternative. I haven't any real experience of those, save for an experimental one I made from a beer cooler. I have several hundred winter wooden nuke boxes, and it would get very expensive to convert my operation to styrofoam. I'm not advocating the return to skeps, but when I started the PowerPoint, I kept changing my mind on how to write it. Should I start with my own observations? Well, no, that seemed too egotistical. Should I start with the physicist's observations? Well, no, I have too much trouble with the math to start there. I decided to touch on those things, but a better place to start seemed to be with some history on wintering that I have enjoyed reading by one of my favorite writers. Bernard Mobus was a German, and he was captured and kept in Britain as a prisoner in the Second World War. After the war, he stayed, worked on farms, kept bees, and became a beekeeping advisor for Scotland. He wrote 2 articles that were published in the ABJ in the late 90s, and a third which wasn't published as far as I can tell, which is a shame because I think it's brilliant. And in this article, he said, wooden hives of modern design go back about 150 years to Langstroth's discovery of the bee way. 150 years is a short time span only when compared with the skep, which had been in use for some 2,000 years. Beekeeping in modern hives also started anew by experimentation. Alas, it often exploited the advantages of apitechnology and ignored the centuries of experiences which skep beekeeping had given old folk. The point is that we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that we have all the answers. We should keep an open mind, because in the big scheme of things, modern frame beekeeping has not been around that long. But before we move on to modern hives, I think we need to consider the bee's preferred home, the tree. Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist, introduced a concept known as the extended phenotype. In this idea, the effects of a creature's genes are not confined to their body, but extend into the environment. A popular example of this is the beaver. Without its dam, a beaver is lost. It's the same for bees and their combs in a tree. Without their combs, honeybees are nothing. What Mobus said was that in nature, thick walls of hollow trees gave more protection, and overall heat losses were smaller in the smaller, therefore warmer space. Further protection was afforded to the colony when it fastened its combs to the roof of the cavity and filled the combs above their heads with honey reserves. The bee way between combs and the closed cavity avoided through ventilation. Passages between combs were wider where brood had been reared last and where food had been consumed, and here was no barrier against the escape of the waste gases of combustion, of heat generation, to keep the cluster warm. The natural tendency for ventilation of gases was downwards. Bees were as warm as a bug in a rug. Few bees faced the coldest temperatures, as most of the bees of the cluster were where warmth had not escaped, and here they saved their energies to stay alive. So when I consider what Mobus said, and then apply what Dawkins says, it seems that we are likely missing some efficiency opportunities in wintering the further we move away from the tree as the best place for bees in the winter. A friend of mine sent me a research paper from the University of Illinois, and in the introduction, the authors explain something about wintering research in the 20th century and the lack of it in the 21st century. They said, because bees are mostly restricted to a nest with finite food stores, winter is usually considered the highest risk period for colony survival. As such, there is a long history of beekeepers employing management strategies to improve overwinter survival for their colonies. From at least the early 20th century, beekeepers in cold climates commonly covered their hives with wooden sleeves or woolly insulation material, partially buried their hives in trenches, and kept hives inside cellars. In popular beekeeping manuals of the time, it was even recommended to forego uncovered outdoor wintering completely. For example, it was recommended that beekeepers must overwinter indoors or with wrappings if they were located north of 42 degrees north, which is about Chicago or Boston, Massachusetts in the US. And outdoor overwintering was only recommended south of 40 degrees, which is Indianapolis or Philadelphia. So what that tells us is that even before varroa came here, beekeepers in the north had trouble wintering their bees. Now, the latitude slide is here because I find it useful when we consider what is local. The Illinois researchers said, starting in the 1940s, varroa performed a series of experiments showing that winter clusters in hives near Madison, Wisconsin, which is about 43 degrees north, could efficiently thermoregulate outdoors without extra coverings. And soon after, Simpson further explained how bees achieve nest thermoregulation. And so recommendations began to shift, and beekeepers were more likely to overwinter colonies outdoors without heavy wrappings. However, hive covers have continued to be recommended in beekeeping text and extension documents, especially those targeted at beekeepers in colder northern climates, though the exact definition of the ranges was not often explicitly stated. It is still not clear how necessary or valuable wrappings are in many cases, especially in areas where winters are not extremely cold. Then, after relating modern beekeeping challenges, the authors go on to say, quoting again here, due to these factors, wintering has become even more perilous, with managed honeybee losses posing major challenges for modern beekeepers. So hive coverings or wraps remain appealing to many beekeepers as a practice for aiding in colony overwintering. Despite this, there is a surprising paucity of published scientific research on the effects and efficacy of hive covers, especially from the 21st century. They were studying hive covers. Now, stepping away from this study for a moment, let's take a look at wintering losses in the 21st century. I'm a fan of the Bee Informed Partnership data that used to be shared freely, and spent time on there learning what I could from it until it sort of disappeared. And the person was able to search by management method. And I drew this data from the site before the curtain fell, and they reduced what they would share. The following are a few screenshots which show how dire the overwintering situation is. As you are probably aware, the larger the sample size, the more seriously you can take the data. And these are large sample sizes. For Minnesota and Wisconsin, they had records from 2,200 backyard responders who managed 16,000 colonies, and 163 sideliners who managed 22,000. And I ignored the commercial beekeepers because for the most part, their colonies are moved all over the country and don't winter in my area. You can see the average backyarder lost 58% of their colonies, and the average sideliner lost 47%. I would imagine it's, well, I know it's just as tough up where you guys are. Now, that might be easier to see in this bar chart. Backyard is losing 58%, sideline is losing 47%.
Adrian, would you define sideliner for some of the listeners that might not be familiar with the term?
They defined it as beekeepers who had 50 colonies or more. I also kept data showing what the results showed for those who reported using a varroa control product or not. For sideliners, those who did lost 44%, and for those who didn't report losing 60% of their colonies. So I have no arguments with part of the message that current beekeeping teachers give out. The message is that if you don't control your mites, the colony will die. That is true. But backyard beekeepers, those who reported treating lost 54% of their colonies, and those who didn't lost 62%. And there is a school of thought that lays all of the blame for wintering losses at the feet of varroa. But I think that's too simplistic an explanation. Varroa management matters, but those of us wintering bees in skinny boxes are concluding that the skinny boxes, their insulation and ventilation are as important as well. Another way to look at it is that even when trying to follow what is known as conventional best management practices, lots of colonies died. So the inability to manage varroa is definitely a large component of winter losses, but winter losses occurred before varroa was implicated. There are a few ways to look at winter, but I see it as two transitions. These two transitions occur between October and April down here. When we pull back the lids and look at our bees in the fall, the bees themselves all look the same, but they're not. Almost all of the summer bees will be dead by the end of the year. That's a natural part of wintering, and the others, the diutinous bees, we know as winter bees, will be around until the spring if they live. If these diutinous bees are numerous, healthy, and well provisioned with honey, these transitions occur without incident. But when they're not, it becomes very obvious. A colony heavily infested with mites and the fatal viruses in my area will fail before the end of the year because it was unable to make the batch of winter bees that was needed to take it to spring. But I also hear from beekeepers that winter their bees in 10-frame equipment that they will lose some colonies in February and March when their bees fail to make that second transition from diutinous bees to summer bees. They either dwindle down to nothing, starve out a few inches away from the honey, or limp along with a bad case of chalk brood. Now, there may be other factors, but I class those deaths as wintering system failures because I don't think that the bees have failed the beekeeper or the beekeeper has failed the bees. I believe the wintering system has failed both of them. So this traditional requirements for northern beekeeping are a young queen, a hive in 310-frame deep swaying 150 pounds or more, lots of young healthy bees who have a low 1 to 2% mite count, a wrap, an upper entrance, a lower entrance, a moisture absorbing drying board or a quilt box or insulation. This system of variants or variants of it has been taught by many northern authorities forever. And I'm confident that under certain circumstances, it can still work well. It can, if you are able to follow the instructions and timing and have some luck. The biggest problem in this list is obtaining a large cluster of young mite virus-free bees that will survive until spring. The details vary, but as the researchers at the Dolezal Bee Lab in the University of Illinois said, there seems to be little research in the 21st century in some essential details. These Illinois researchers added something to the wintering science. This was some good work. In summary, they lost one colony of the 22 that were wrapped and given top insulation, but lost 6 out of 21 that were uncovered. What they found was that top insulation and wrap were helpful in the spring, This is the kind of work I want to see. More studies, more experiments and data to help us solve the wintering puzzle. What is interesting to me is that the researchers were working in Urbana, Illinois, which is in relative terms very southerly to you guys and quite southerly even to me. Even at that latitude, they found a benefit in survival terms of wrapping their colonies. And when I started beekeeping, I discovered that online everyone has an opinion. And there are so many opinions out there, it is as difficult to sort out what's relevant. So I filter by advice by latitude. I think it helps to keep latitude in mind when you consider wintering advice. It won't surprise you to hear I pay a lot of attention to the Canadians because they have a long, cold winter. And I added Whitehorse in the Yukon to this list because of the contributions that Etienne Tardif is making to beekeeping as he brings his physics background. Etienne speaks at least 3 languages: English, French, and physics. 60 degrees north is about 1,100 miles further north than Minneapolis. Now, I've listened and watched what Etienne has to say, and I find the physics challenging. He places great emphasis on location because his winter bees have to live a lot longer than ours, and he winters his colonies outside in temperatures that are often below -40. As you know, winter comes early and lasts way longer up there than what it does down here, and he uses a lot of insulation. But what I found really interesting was that when he discusses insulation, he says it matters, but it matters most in the spring. In the period during which the bees are not raising brood, they only have to keep the cluster warm enough to keep themselves alive. And that means that the difference between the outside temperature and the inside temperature is not quite as important even in the north. In the spring, that is a very different matter. They have to keep the brood at a constant 93 Fahrenheit. And so the consistency provided by the insulation is most helpful then. However, Etienne says if you provide both a top and a bottom entrance, heat that might otherwise leak from the cluster and warm the air around the colony is vented outside because of the chimney effect. And this eliminates the benefit of the insulation. If you want to know more about that, I recommend you go to his north of 60 beekeeping site. He's got a lot of data. And it's these last 2 points that cause the most consternation from the beekeepers who are heavily invested in the traditional way of doing things. When you've been trained to believe that moisture will drip on the cluster and go to great lengths to eliminate it from the colony, it's really hard to hear that those efforts may result in the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. I empathize. It must be incredibly hard for beekeeping educators to accept that a Canadian mechanical engineer might be onto something that contradicts what they have as core beliefs. Etienne is not the first person to describe how badly the through ventilation system serves our bees. Mobus goes on about it at length, and how unsuited our thin pine boxes are for winter. I have recently heard from a couple of wintering lectures that I admire for other reasons that the wintering cluster is like a big furry animal, and when healthy, insulation doesn't matter, and you just need to keep it dry over the winter and it's going to survive. But as I see it, the data doesn't support that contention. Winter is a problem. Many bee scientists may be ignoring physics, but not Dr. Tom Seeley. And as I return to the latitude page, I add Ithaca, New York into the list because of Tom Seeley. Ithaca is where Tom Seeley did his field work, and he learned that swarms seem to prefer a cavity of about the volume of a 10 frame deep in a tree with a lower entrance. As I recall, the entrance is about 1/4 and an inch in diameter. So from a latitude perspective, Ithaca lies on a line only about 60 miles or so south of the Minneapolis latitude, which I am on. And so for my compromises with the bees' preferences for a wintering in a narrow cavity, I choose a a volume of a 5/5 colony, which has the same volume with a small entrance. Now, for me, that means wintering the bees in 10 frames, but putting them in 2 stacked 5-frame boxes per colony with insulation on the top, and then pushing them against neighboring colonies to share warmth. This method is fully described in my book, which is available on Amazon if you want it, and I'm not offended if you don't. And the data in the book shows my lifetime wintering survival numbers up until 22. And for bees kept in new equipment up to that time, I have a lifetime success rate of 80%, which is a lot better than I've done in 10-frame equipment. I try to overwinter as many colonies as I can in my stacked 5/5 configurations because they seem to do better in these skinny cavities. I think it's important to recognize our biases. In my case, I have a strong bias towards insulation. The idea that a cluster of bees can just shrug off the cold and survive unaffected doesn't hold much sway with me. And that's probably because all of my beekeeping has been in Wisconsin, where it's cold. It makes no sense to waste energy, and I think we can best serve our northern bees by keeping them cozy. Now, another way to look at it was this recently released information seems logical to me. Our study suggests that increased energy overwintering bees used to maintain hive temperatures reduces energy available for immune functions, which would leave overwintering bees more susceptible to disease infections or leading to high winter colony losses. Researchers have found a metabolic pathway at the cellular level that shows that winter is tough on bees. One of the strategies they were contemplating to fix it was to treat them with a gene activator that's being used experimentally as an anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer treatment. I don't think our bees need chemotherapy. Rather than that, I think it makes more sense to insulate our hives and reduce the number of bees that need to be occupied in warming them. As I see it, the traditional method of wintering bees in large drafty boxes relies upon the resilience of the bees to overcome the pessimum conditions they are housed in. It relies upon unnaturally large clusters of winter, those diatomeous bees, living until spring. It relies upon the power of the cluster to overcome our cold environment. But what or who is to blame for the fact that wintering losses for stationary beekeepers have remained at about half for as long as we can remember in the cold north? It may be conservatism, a lack of imagination, a lack of research. It could be overstating varroa as the problem. It could be tradition. It could be beekeeper education. Perhaps a lack of collaboration between scientific disciplines. Too much in the 10-frame box thinking and not enough out of the 10-frame box thinking. I believe we can winter more of our northern colonies successfully if we can get them into better systems for the winter. And by better, I mean more insulated, especially for those of us living north of the 40th parallel. Whilst the concept of insulation seems relatively straightforward to me, ventilation does not. I have a hard time understanding how the bees' best needs are served. If we look at the perfect tree with a single hole in it, then it seems obvious that they know how to manage it. However, the most common systems in operation, including mine, use 2 holes. It's something I struggle with. Bees in a cavity naturally ventilate by blowing air down below the cluster. But if you have a lower entrance, and the air can get out. However, my system is a compromise because I found a single bottom entrance can get plugged by dead bees and ice. The bees can suffocate, so I provide a second entrance. This entrance is a 3/4 inch or 7/8 inch auger hole reduced by about a half with a segment of wine cork. The auger hole is 3 inches from the top of the top box. The bottom entrance is 3/8 by 3/4, and these entrances are small to keep mice out. I like to think that the reduced area slows down the loss of air and consequently heat as compared to larger entrances, but I don't know that for sure. I came upon this writing after I developed my system of overwintering. This was Mobus. On the other hand, the word chimney effect says it all. Heat is used, indeed wasted, to drive the system, and this is something the bees can ill afford, except in a paradise where bees do not have to think of winter through a long, cold winter. Conservation is a watchword spelled by the bees in capital. I mentioned earlier that Bernard Mobus wrote a trilogy on wintering bees back in the late 90s, and two were published in the ABJ, but the third wasn't. And this is a real pity, because if his ideas and arguments had been taken up, then beekeeping would be further ahead. So I worried that my system might be losing more heat than needed because of this chimney effect. Because if I have an upper entrance, not a top entrance, mind you, an upper entrance, because it's 3 inches from the top. And how Etienne explains that is when brood rearing starts later in the winter, the difference in temperature between the outside and that of the warming brood nest can make the chimney effect worse. So to amuse myself, a winter or so ago, I decided to run a citizen science project to see if I could learn anything. And what I wanted to know was whether it was better to winter with the reduced alga hole in the upper box or a reduced alga hole in the lower box. I intended to find out if there was some noticeable difference when I compared stores used, colonies surviving, and colony strengths. And you may wonder why the holes are so small. Well, when I started overwintering in 5/5 frame colonies, one of my main concerns was how to keep mice out of the boxes. I'd seen that mice can run right through a 1-inch alga hole and read a 3/8 inch was too small for them to get through. But a 3/8 hole is too small for the volume of bees that want to pass through in the summer. So I opted to use alga holes of about the size of a wine cork because the corks are free and I didn't want to buy corks. And I reduced those holes further for winter by putting a segment of cork in. In some respects, that logic was faulty because if the mice wanted to, they could simply chew their way through the cork. I'm going to confess I didn't give the bees' need for ventilation much thought at all. My focus was on the mice. And this has been my standard wintering arrangement for years. There are 4 colonies sitting side by side, with the outer ones protected by 2 inches of R10 styrofoam, and the gaps between each colony filled by squishy Reflectix insulation. Under that 4-pack wooden outer cover, each colony is protected by a feed bag or plastic inner cover, and then a further 2 inches of R10 styrofoam. So 2 inches of styrofoam on the top and 2 inches on the outer sides. And I believe, based upon my successes, that wintering bees in this manner works well for them. However, what I don't know is if there is a tweak or two that might improve things even more. You'll note in my standard arrangement, the 4-pack on the right, that the top alga hole is half open. That hole is 3 inches from the top of the box. And we know that heat rises, and I imagine that above that hole is a pillow of air, and that some heat is wasted as it moves out, as warm air moves out through the little hole. So I thought to myself, if I assume there is a pillow of heat that extends down 3 inches from the top, wouldn't it be better to have that top alga hole closed and the holes in the bottom box open to the same degree? If the vent hole was a box down and further 9 5/8 down, shouldn't it be warmer in the colony? If it were warmer in the colony, it might be reflected by less food being used over the winter, a difference in survival, or a difference in strengths. So I set up an experiment to see if the difference in the reduced alga holes made a difference in the food consumed, survival, or strengths. So what I did was I got 2 groups of colonies overwintered. One group with the upper box reduced alga hole, one with the lower box reduced alga hole. Colonies were wintered in groups of 4. Respective colonies were matched by varroa load, all in the same apiary, 12 in each group, which was 3 packs of 4 colonies in each group, all colonies headed by queens from the same breeder mother. I had a Harbo VSH breeder queen from 2020, and I used her daughters. So I placed the colonies in the bee yard, and I keep careful notes. There's my record. On August the 4th, I came back and I boosted the colonies from their 3 or 5 frames to 10 frames by adding a second level of drawn frames, including honey and brood. Now, note that I also kept track of the mite count of the brood that was donated. I didn't want to take a chance that I might doom a colony by adding brood that was particularly heavily infested. At the end of August, I started weighing the colonies, and when the goldenrod was done, I started feeding them. You can see that by October the 5th, I was done with weighing. The colony's weights ranged from 70 to 78 pounds. And here's a side note. It might seem surprising that I consider adding brood with an infestation as high as 3% to a colony. And these bees are from a pure VSH mother. And so my theory is if you are using bees with some form of mite resistance, at some point that resistance has to earn its keep. Otherwise, there's no point to using it. I don't know what percentage of my survival successes can be attributed to the VSH genes, the small cavities, the insulation, the small entrances, or not buying replacement colonies for more than 10 years. I expect all of those things factor into it. Dr. Megan Milbrath explained in a lecture I saw in 2016 that a surefire way to make mite infestation lethal was to combine it with one of the latest deformed wingform viruses that come in on non-local bees from warm places. My experience seems to validate her theory because by not importing bees from warm places every year and using stock with some resistance, I believe I am avoiding the most lethal viruses. On November the 19th, I moved the bees into their winter positions in groups of 4. I put the higher mite colonies on the outside of the 4 packs because I thought they were the most likely ones to perish. This is what the apiary looked like from the back of my truck. And it got colder, and then we had a cleansing flight on December the 15th. So during the winter, I check on the apiaries every 2 weeks, and I shovel the electric fence, and I look and listen for signs of life. And I continued to do that until the weather moderated in mid-March. And on March the 16th, it was 52 degrees, so I unwrapped, scraped off the bottom boards, weighed the colonies, and then wrapped them back up again. And so what did I find? I lost 1 colony in each of the control group and in the experimental group, and those 2 were dinks that were alive on March the 16th, but had died by April the 9th. These are the weights when compared against each other. Combined, the 24 colonies lost an average of 18 pounds. There was an average of 17.5 pounds lost in the group with the upper entrance and an average of 18.8 lost in the group in the lower entrances. And the overall differences were not that great. You can see that the losses in weight were all over the place. And this is raw data. So I texted my eldest daughter, who's in college and pays more attention in a statistics class than I ever did. So Zoe responded, and her opinion was there was no statistical basis for me to infer that one group was different from the other because I had manipulated the height of the reduced alcohol entrance. She went on to say that 12 was a pretty small sample size to compare 2 groups. But I knew that already, but we do what we do. So let's review what I wanted to know. It didn't seem to matter whether the reduced vent hole was in the bottom or the top box, which surprised me. I was expecting to see a difference. There wasn't a difference in survival. There wasn't a significant difference in stores used, and I couldn't see a difference in the strength of the colonies that was related to whether they had an upper vent hole or a lower vent hole. In summary, what I've concluded is that insulation does matter, but it matters more so in the spring when brood is being raised. In spring, as bees turn their population from winter bees back to summer bees, the colony should be viewed as a nursery, perhaps even an incubator. As to ventilation, I still have many questions about it. I suspect that my bees, wintering in 5/5 frame colonies, have benefited from the increased humidity that my highly reduced entrances provide, but I have no evidence to back that suspicion up. Latitude is important. It is evident from historical data in the US that winter was a problem before varroa came, and logically, so even when varroa is under control, winter is a problem, and we need more research to determine what's effective. My take-home message is that if more of us are to become sustainable, we, the beekeepers, can do some of the work ourselves through field trials and experimentation. We need to experiment, collaborate, and communicate, both the things that work and the things that don't. There doesn't seem to be any point waiting for university researchers to provide the science because that we want on wintering methods because they're focused on other things. If we need funds, there are grants available for well thought out projects, but we don't always need it if we're just documenting and tweaking what we're already doing. And here are some references.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Adrian.
A person asks if I have a link to the unpublished Mobus article, and I don't. I can't. It was on a styrofoam insulation hive website at one stage, but it disappeared. I'm really interested in the backstory about why it wasn't published. Even now, it is so confrontational that I don't know this, but I wonder if it was too political to publish it at the time, because he took apart a lot of Northern American bee researchers who were quite popular at the time. I just have a feeling it was something to do with that. Someone asked, can we use follower boards to reduce a hive box to 5 frames and stack 2 for a narrow system? Absolutely, you can. That's a version of what Mike Palmer does. If you do that, make sure they're bee tight. I did it once and screwed it up because I found all the bees on one side in the spring, and they all looked great on that one side, but there was only one colony. I started off with 2. Also, the thing that if you do that, then you have to make sure that that top box, you'll have to individually inspect each of those frames of honey in the top of each side, because if you weighed that box to see how much was there, you could misinterpret how much was in each separate compartment. Well, absolutely, you can do it.
A lot of times when it's really in the dead of winter and in late December and January, if we might get a day that gets into the 40s, which is actually pretty good for a cleansing flight here for our winters, but it's so gray and dark that the bees don't fly anyway.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, just one of the challenges.
yeah.
So, I, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on your upper entrance was still several inches below the top.
3 inches down, yeah.
3 inches
It's
down. I
yeah.
wonder if you had any thoughts on if how you think it might be different with an upper entrance in the inner cover, which was, I think, what when Etienne was doing his research, that's what he was
Yeah.
comparing it to, like a notched inner cover upper entrance versus a bottom entrance.
I think the difference between my upper entrance and that top entrance is that top entrance is at the very top, and my three
Right,
inches down, if
right.
you can picture the side of the frame, it's actually, and I've got 5 frames pushed together. It doesn't blow directly onto the cluster. It's below the frame ear, and it's on those wide shoulders,
Right
which are
onto a
sitting
frame then,
right
the side of the frame.
onto the side of the frame. So so it's not the same as the as those who put an entrance a few inches from the and make an auger hole a few inches from the bottom of a box. Because if you have an auger hole a few inches from a bottom of a box, there can be an intrusive draft of air unless you
Right.
cover it up
I,
with a shield.
I was actually asking a slightly different question. I was saying, that Etienne was comparing it to a notched inner cover where the
Yes.
entrance would be right on top because
Yes.
your
Yes.
setup would still have a 3-inch dead air cavity that's retaining heat. And that would, I'm sure that would change the thermodynamics of the situation. I'm not
Yeah.
smart enough to say how.
Yeah. And this person says, how much space should there be above the frames for top insulation? My reflectix lays on the frames and worry should be raised a bit. I wouldn't be worried. I think if you've got your reflectix, the main thing is that if you've got reflex on the frames and then you've got some more insulation on top of that and it's all pushed down, I'd be very happy with that myself.
You talked about a powdered sugar test for mites.
Yeah.
And that's not something that I have ever done. And I know that I have read that it's very effective, and I have read that it's not effective at all. But it seems to be more of a whose side they're on and than a data-based argument. So I'm hoping you can
Well,
share some
it's
information on that.
yeah, it's the powdered sugar test is what they is I'm the closest university system to me that has a B lab is the University of Minnesota. And they developed the powdered sugar test. And they did that and it works pretty well until it gets humid. Once it gets humid, it gets damp and it doesn't do its job. That's the only mite test that I learned. I've been trying to when it gets humid. I've been using the Randy Oliver method of using Dawn Ultra dish soap. I think it is,
Hmm.
which is better than using alcohol.
One of the things I'm talking to people about doing is doing splits just as a normal way of beekeeping, as a way of being sustainable, um, um, to go into winter with more colonies than you need, and as a brood. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about splits as a part of your beekeeping operation and why you do them, and the method you
Well,
told me about, the drone culling.
if you accept that on average 50% of colonies will die if you don't do anything, or even if you're moderately successful, if you go into winter with twice as many as you want, then you're likely to end up with what you need. And if you get efficient, you'll end up with more surviving, and then you'll end up with more bees, and then more work in the spring. And so, what I control mites with biotechnical methods, and one of those methods is basically just harvesting the mites. When you make a split, if you can at the same time it so that you put in a frame of drone larvae after the new queen has been mated, and she might have eggs there, but before her own larvae are mature, you can capture most of those mites.
You put drone brood from another colony in so that it will
Yeah,
be a magnet for the varroa, and then you remove it after it's capped.
yeah, because the varroa evolved um, to lay in drone larvae because they found that they are more successful in drones. They're 10 to 12 times more attractive to varroa mites than worker larvae.
Well, I appreciate your time. If there's no more questions, you've stayed up late for us, and I am very grateful. And it's great information.
Appreciate it.
You
Yep.
bet. All right. Good luck, guys.
Thank you very much, Adrian.
All right. Good night.
All right.